Our next speaker is Pradeep Moise, who I believe worked a lot with Incompact3d during his PhD, and now he has moved in Southampton to work with Nielsen Dam, but he's going to present his work about vortex breakdown in swirling flows. And so please, Pradeep, you have 15 minutes. We can see your screen, so everything is fine.
Okay, thank you, Sylvain.
And we
hello.
Can hear you.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so hello, I'm Pradeep Moise, and I'll be speaking about simulations of vortex breakdown using Incompact3d. So as Sylvain mentioned, I'm currently in University of Southampton, but the results I'll be presenting were carried out as part of my PhD in the Department of Aerospace Engineering at Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru, under the supervision of Professor Joseph Matthew. All the simulations were carried out using Sahasrat, a Cray XC40 system at IISc. And I would also like to thank Rowan Ryan for help with large AD simulations that I'm going to be discussing. Okay, so an introduction to vortex breakdown. So swirling flows are characterized by the presence of non-zero axial and azimuthal velocity components, and above a critical amount of rotation, they exhibit a phenomenon known as vortex breakdown. And it's defined by the development of an internal stagnation point or a recirculation zone in the flow. It's observed in a variety of flow situations, including tornadoes, tip vortices, delta winds, turbomissionary combustors, etc. So here I show you two famous photographs. So the left-hand side is that of a flight test of a high-angle research vehicle by NASA, in which they are injecting smoke into a vortex that is present there. And you can see as the flow develops spatially, you can see that there is an abrupt expansion here, which is indicative of the presence of a stagnation point in the flow. And that's, you can infer vortex breakdown to have occurred in that case. And here on the right-hand side, I show you a water tunnel experiment in which they're injecting a dye, and you have a delta wing, which is placed at a high angle of attack. And you can see that the dye is getting engulfed into the leading edge vortex associated with the delta wing, and it abruptly kinks here or abruptly expands here. And that's again indicative of the presence of stagnation points in the flow. And here it takes a spiral path. Here it delineates approximately ellipsoidal recirculation zone. So you can have different types or forms of vortex breakdown based on the structure of the recirculation zone that is formed. So the most commonly observed ones are the two that I just described and are shown here. So again, dye visualization of a swirling flow in which you have dye injected along the center line. And you can see that it kinks and then it ends up going around an ellipsoidal structure, which is actually a recirculation zone. It enters into that structure through its rear and gets mixed a lot. And then it exits out, and then it takes an almost spiral path outside. That's called as the bubble form of vortex breakdown because of this ellipsoidal shape of the recirculation zone. And here you have another form, which is the spiral form of vortex breakdown, in which the dye just takes a spiral path after it kinks due to vortex breakdown. Another form of vortex breakdown, which is relatively unexplored, is the conical form of vortex breakdown that I show on the right. It was first reported and identified by Bjorn, Chomas, and Huer in their very crucial paper in Journal of Fluid Mechanics. And it was reported only for a specific family of swirling flows, which is the swirling jets. So here you have a nozzle, and the flow is from top to bottom, and you have the flow to be a jet, which is rotating now. And you can see that, again, it stagnates here and then expands almost conically, hence the name conical form of vortex breakdown. And this form has not been studied much. It's actually never been simulated in full 3 dimensions before, or for turbulent conditions. And there are only a handful of experiments which actually identify this form. And since it occurs only for swirling jets, it serves as the motivation for our study on examining vortex breakdown phase states that occur for swirling jets. And for this, of course, we used Incompact3d. So we have carried out both direct numerical and large AD simulations. For the large AD simulations, we used the explicit filtering approach. It was proposed by Matthew and group. And the approach is basically a reformulation of the approximate deconvolution model that was proposed by Moise. And it reformulates the equations to a simpler form. And in its essence, it just uses a low-pass filter for filtering the velocity field. And because Incompact3d is already built on the framework of compact schemes, it was very easy to integrate, again, filters into the solver to apply the filter for the large AD simulations. In addition to this, we have also done stability analysis, linear stability analysis on the flow field to examine the helical structures that develop in the flow. And for that, we have used, to compute the base flows required for the stability analysis, we also incorporated a tool for selective frequency damping approach into Incompact3d, but I won't cover much of that in this talk. Okay, so with regard to the simulations, they're quite straightforward use of Incompact3d. So I prescribe an inflow profile, and the domain, of course, is Cartesian, and you can choose lateral boundary conditions as either periodic or free slip. Again, going back to the inflow, it's a model of laminar swirling jet, referred to as Maxworthy profile, which was inferred based on experimental results. So here I show you the axial velocity and azimuthal velocity components of the flow. It's a typical jet-like profile with a corresponding axial shear layer and a co-flow, which is usually added for entrainment, which is standard procedure for simulating jets. And in addition to that, we now impose an azimuthal velocity component where you have a region in which the flow is having u theta is proportional to the radial distance. And that's where the flow is behaving like a rigid body rotation. Whereas you again have a shear layer in this velocity component, and then it tapers to 0. So this is a non-dimensional profile. You use the jet radius as the length scale, and the velocity scale is the centerline axial velocity component. And based on this, the Reynolds number that we studied was 200 and 1000. And you can have different parameters, but the parameters that we varied was the swirl number, which is the slope of the azimuthal velocity at r equal to 0, which represents how much it is rotating with respect to the axial velocity. Okay, so we were able to simulate this for the 2 Reynolds number cases. At 200, a Reynolds number of 200, we had a laminar flow. So I show here tracer particle visualization. Again, this was incorporated into Incompact3d, and we just supplied tracer particles. And here's an instantaneous picture, which is a streak line picture. And you can see that the flow, as it goes along the streamwise direction, it rotates, but it also stagnates. A stagnation point develops. An ellipsoidal recirculation zone that is characteristic of a bubble form of vortex breakdown appears, and the streak line tracer particles enter it through the rear, and then mix inside, and then exit out and take a spiral path outside, which can also be inferred from the path lines taken by some of the particles shown here. And this is for the laminar case. That's the bubble form of vortex breakdown. But we could also simulate the conical form of vortex breakdown, which is shown here. And you can see that again, it stagnates and then it expands approximately conically, which is the characteristic feature of the recirculation zone of a conical form of vortex breakdown. And another feature to note is that you can see the lateral extent. So it expands almost to 20 times the radius of the jet, whereas compared to the bubble form, which is maybe 1 times the radius of the jet. So that's the recirculation zone size associated with the conical form. And you can also see that it's not rotating much. It's not swirling as it keeps expanding radially in a conical fashion. Okay, what about the large eddy simulations? These were carried out at a higher Reynolds number. So here I show you results at 1000. Here the flow turns turbulent, and here are two cases, a swirl number of 1.3 and 1.4. I'm showing the lambda 2 isosurfaces here. Again, characteristic of the bubble form, you have an ellipsoidal recirculation zone and a spiral structure downstream. And here for the highest swirl, you can see that the flow is already transitioned to turbulence within the recirculation zone associated with the bubble form of vortex breakdown. Here's the conical form of vortex breakdown. You again, here I show a vorticity magnitude here, and you have an expansion which is approximately conical. And on the right-hand side, I show you lambda 2 isosurfaces. Because it's not swirling so much, the conical shear layer is not captured in the lambda 2. But you can now see that there are vortical structures which are overlaid onto the shear layer associated with the recirculation zone of the conical form of vortex breakdown. Okay, so here I show you the velocity fields, projected velocity fields. I've rotated the figure. I'll explain why with the next slide. So the streamwise direction is now bottom to top, and you have the swirling jet. So the velocity field is basically the axial and radial components with the azimuthal component ignored. And you can see here that the jet stagnates, and you have a stagnation point and then a conical expansion. And you can also identify the structures associated with the vortices that are present. Okay, the reason I had shown it in that fashion was to compare it with experiments. So here's an experiment from Liang and Maxworthy on swirling jets. And the velocity fields that are shown here resemble quite remarkably well with the velocity fields that we obtained. And but an important point is that even though these velocity fields show the conical recirculation zone, the flow state was not identified as a CVB, a conical vortex breakdown, in Liang and Maxworthy. And this seems to be a trend in a lot of the literature available, in which this conical form of vortex breakdown, even though it seems to be present once you start digging, it has not been identified as such. And one of the possible reasons for why this is the case would be for due to hysteresis features and the bistability of these forms. So here I compare laminar results at a Reynolds number of 200, and it was possible for me to sustain the bubble form of vortex breakdown to different swirl numbers at which the conical form is usually present, by starting from an initial condition, which is the bubble form itself, and slowly changing the inflow conditions such that I can sustain the bubble form. So this is a typical hysteresis study. And so I was able to sustain this bubble form at a swirl number of 1.5 and a Reynolds number of 200, at which a conical form is usually present, which means that for the same boundary conditions, both the bubble form and the conical form coexist and are chosen based on what initial conditions you start from. And so these are the bistable forms, and this is the most remarkable result of my PhD. And it shows that you can have a recirculation zone size which is of similar length scale as that of the inflow jet. But for the conical, that's for the bubble form. But for the conical form, you have approximately 15 times a recirculation zone, which is for the laminar case, and it's remarkably different. And these two exist for the same inflow conditions. But once the flow becomes turbulent, I'm showing again, projected streamlines here. So I'm ignoring the azimuthal velocity component. And you can see that both the bubble and the conical forms coexist. And now the differences in the recirculation zone sizes are reduced. And this might be one of the reasons why these two forms have been misidentified. But you can again see that an ellipsoidal structure associated with the bubble and a initial conical expansion. Okay, so I'll conclude with that. So basically what I've shown is that results from the first DNS and LES, large eddy simulations of the bubble and conical forms of vortex breakdown. And these have been observed in experiments, and we have managed to simulate them. And using hysteresis studies, we have been able to confirm their coexistence as bistable forms. And we were also able to examine the helical modes that appear for the bubble form of vortex breakdown. And I have not covered that, but I've used selective frequency damping to examine these flow states. And a final slide. So one of the major implication of the study is that if you do not identify the correct form, you can see that the flow structures are quite different, the dynamic flow structures. So even though the mean flow might be similar, the dynamic flow structures are quite different, and misidentifying these can lead to design problems, especially in combustors where swirling flows are highly used. And there is a lot of scope for future work. So most of this conical form was not been explored. What's the effect of including noise geometry? What's the effect of including inflow turbulence? All these are aspects that can be easily studied in Incompact3d framework. An additional question is for the bistable forms, can you select a desired vortex breakdown form based on a flow control technique? So these are all the possible applications. Thank you. I can take questions.
Thank you very much. There's one question from Eric Lambalet, which I wanted to ask anyway, so that's good.
Sure.
So it's about we are asking because we have been doing a lot of turbulent jet simulation, and we have encountered some issues with the outflow boundary condition.
Okay.
So, and we were wondering if did you have any issues, or are the vortex breakdown features sensitive to the outflow boundary condition that you are using?
Okay, so I didn't mention this, but we are actually using a buffer zone at the outflow. So I incorporated, so you can use the same filters that you're using for the LES, but now you can selectively filter in the region close to the outflow. And because of that, you can suppress any recirculation zone. So the first aspect that you need to do is to include co-flow. I'm assuming that you would be including a co-flow in your jet simulations.
Yes.
That would reduce the amount of recirculations that you get.
So you have a small co-flow as well?
Yeah, so I also have a 1% co-flow.
Okay.
And in addition to that, by including the buffer zone at the outflow, I was able to suppress huge problems at the outflow conditions.
Very good.
Yeah.
Same conclusion as us. And I have one final question. It's about your tracer particle tool. Do you do that at the time of the simulation, or you do it at post-processing?
Yeah. No, it's not post-processing. It was incorporated into Incompact3d by, well, I don't know if it's the most efficient way to do it, but I just used the positions at, okay, it's an involved procedure, but I managed to get it incorporated into Incompact3d so that it is done real time and not as a post-processing using the velocity fields and so on.
Thank you. I might contact you about that. And one final question from Arash is, how do you initialize the simulation? So your initial condition is what is your initial condition?
Okay, great. So that differs between the whether I'm doing a hysteresis study or not. So if I'm not doing a hysteresis study, I'll be taking a streamwise invariant initial condition, or what is known as columnar initial conditions.
Yeah.
And yeah, if I'm doing a hysteresis study, I'll start from a given flow state. So I'll start from a bubble form, and then I'll change my inflow slowly and so on. But the initial condition is an already existing vortex breakdown state.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pradeep.
Thank you for the opportunity
It's
for
great
presenting.
work, and I think this work will carry on with your supervisor in India. So it's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.